Hello everybody, this is Mr. Yen. And by this point, most of you have completed and submitted the lesson 7.3 work into Google Classroom. Well done. And from what I'm seeing from your classwork, there are a couple of common mistakes that I wanted to go over before we move on. So let's take a look at these examples. Remember that when you're comparing the criteria between two triangles, it's important to look closely at what's marked in the diagram. So in these two triangles, all three sides are marked as being congruent between the two triangles. So we said three congruent sides, or side, side, side. If the angles are marked, that's when we say three congruent angles, or angle, angle, angle. These two were pretty good on your classwork. Where it gets a little bit more tricky is if we have two sides and an included angle versus two sides and a non-included angle. And it's important to specify the difference between the two. Let's look at this example on the left of two sides and an included angle. So we have the two sides as being congruent between the two triangles, and the angle that's congruent is in between the two sides. It's touching both of the sides. It's sandwiched in between the two. That's why we call it an included angle. And when we write out the shorthand, we write side, angle, side. The angle is in between the two sides when we list it out, just like it is in the diagram. Now compare that to two sides and a non-included angle. Notice in the diagram, the angle that's congruent is out here. And it's only touching one of the sides. It's not touching both of the congruent sides like it was here. And so that's why we say this is a non-included angle, because it's only touching one of the congruent sides, not both of them. And when we list out the shorthand, that's why we say side, side, angle, right? The angle is on the outside. It's not in between the two sides like it's listed here. So that's the difference between the two. And it's not just enough to say two sides and an angle. For either of these, you have to say two sides and an included angle, or two sides and a non-included angle. We have to be specific. Okay, now let's also look at when you have two angles and a side. In the same way, it's important to distinguish if we're talking about an included side or a non-included side. And here's the difference between the two. Notice in this diagram on the left, we have two congruent angles, and the congruent side that we have is right here. And the side that's congruent is touching both of our congruent angles. It's in between the two congruent angles. That's why we call it an included side. And when we list out the shorthand, that's why we say angle, side, angle. The side is in between the two angles when we list it out like this. Compare this to a non-included side. In this diagram, notice that the congruent side is out here. Out here. It's only touching one of the congruent angles, not both of the congruent angles. So that's why we say it's two angles and a non-included side. The side is not included in between the two angles. When we list out the shorthand, that's why we say angle, angle, and then side. The side is not in between the two angles, but on the outside like that. Okay, keep that in mind when you complete this week's exit ticket. Goodbye and good luck.